All right, we're back. So Daniel had been asking about kind of the idea of reverse engineering consciousness and the fundamentality of consciousness, and I do want us to address those points. Since we're getting into the more specifically into consciousness, I thought maybe it would be useful to give an overview of some of the basic positions. So the ones that I kind of found as I was looking into this topic, of course, there's panpsychism, dualism, materialism, um, pragmatism. Was there any others that I'm forgetting? I think maybe maybe related to pragmatism, I would say contextualism, which is related more to enactivism, but that's also very similar to pragmatism. Um, so maybe I'll say something a little bit about each of these. When I was looking up panpsychism, that's often associated with the view that kind of there's a bit of consciousness in everything, or experience kind of is fundamental. It's in all particles, all whatever fundamental reality is. But there are, in addition to that, there's specific conscious beings like you and me, and maybe animals, and who knows what else. So there's a kind of emergence there, right? Where things have to come together, particles, whatever, have to come together to create larger scale conscious beings. So there is a kind of version of emergentism in panpsychism. In Philip Goff's entry on the Stanford Encyclopedia, he mentions kind of layered emergentism, which is where human minds coexist with micro level conscious subjects. So you get like these layers of consciousness where people, I suppose, would be at least at one of the higher levels, and then you have various other kinds of animals and plants and cells and particles and whatever. There's also a thing called fusionism, I guess, which is where micro level subjects come together to form a larger scale mind, and they fuse together so the particles no longer exist. I guess in layered consciousness, the person is conscious, but also like the atoms and whatever are also conscious that make up the person. But in fusionism, the bits that come together to make up the larger consciousness, fuse together are no longer individually conscious, I guess. There's also, I found Philip Clayton, another philosopher, has proposed another version of emergentist panpsychism, which I think he called gradualist panpsychism, which basically sees consciousness going down to like the cellular level. Basically, when life begins, consciousness begins, and that happens to be what I believe. So I guess I am also a gradualist panpsychist, at least according to this definition. But I don't think Clayton really he kind of goes in a theological direction, I think, to say how life gets started in the first place, whereas I would want to see that naturalistically as its own kind of emergence. Life emerges from non-life consciousness, or some very basic version of experience emerges along with it at the same time. So anyway, that's another panpsychist version of emergence. There's also dualism. Karl Popper seems to have been kind of a substance dualist. He never really quite was clear about where mind came from, but he thought it was emergent in the course of evolution, but also that it was a separate thing that once it existed, interacted with the material world. So it seemed to kind of imply that it was a non-material kind of substance. William Hasker, who I mentioned earlier, kind of continued this line of thinking, arguing that brains produce this kind of field of consciousness, kind of like a magnetic field. And I think there's an interesting truth there. I think there's a lot of interesting work emerging on bioelectricity, and bodies do produce electrical fields. I think that's a factor in what we call consciousness, but I don't think the field itself could be called, I don't think it would make sense to call the field itself consciousness. Although there's, interesting stuff. If you look at the work of biologist Nick Lane, he talks, cells produce these electrical fields, and he considers that at the cellular level to be a kind of consciousness. The electrical field, I guess, reflects the state of the cell, whether it's has what it needs, whether it's dying, whether it's not getting, whether it's deprived of something. So that, maybe there's a kind of truth to that, maybe, which is interesting. Of course, David Chalmers, famous kind of dualist friendly kind of guy, has his own version where information is kind of fundamental and information has a kind of a mental aspect and a physical aspect, I guess. And somehow conscious beings emerge out of that. There's kind of a classic materialist view. I think John Searle puts this well when he says that mental phenomena are caused by neurobiological processes in the brain. Basically, the brain causes or generates consciousness, and there's a lot of, I get confused figuring out what exactly that means for the brain to generate consciousness. Although I like how he puts it, in some ways, he puts it that consciousness is causally reducible to the brain, but not ontologically reducible to the brain. And I think that's a cool phrase, but I don't know what it means then. I mean, it makes it sound like consciousness is a new kind of substance, like William Hasker was talking about. But he claims that that's not what he means, so I'm not exactly sure what he means.
I'd probably add
Yeah.
Kastrop's dissociated alters as a kind of idealist emergence. So it's like
Yeah,
the separateness emerges from the oneness.
right.
Um,
That's a good point. Yeah, so there's also you can look at idealist versions maybe of emergence. I didn't write any of them down, but we talked before about on our fundamental reality episode, we talked about Castro. And then there's also the pragmatist views, which get a little bit complicated. Maybe I'll talk about that later because it's close to my own views, the kind of pragmatist and activist kind of views, which are more close to mine. So maybe I'll save it there. I mean, what do you think? Have any thoughts about kind of these classic positions, panpsychism, dualism, materialism?
yeah, I guess one way we can categorize these different views is what are they saying about consciousness in relation to its fundamental nature, or to the in relation to fundamentals. So when you have the materialists, they talk about emergence. They use emergence to mean consciousness is emergent property because it emerges from non-consciousness and is dependent on non-consciousness. So it depends on matter for its existence as an epiphenomenal reality, a secondary reality. And other views have this a similar idea that, okay, the materialist might be, okay, consciousness itself might be an illusion, or it might just be something like a secondary experience that we have when real reality is material. There are some other views that kind of mix it a little bit together where they say, well, consciousness is true, like the one you mentioned, consciousness is truly a new thing, it's truly a new experience, but it still relies or supervenes on the material. So I think this is how we can categorize these views. Is consciousness something fundamental, or is consciousness supervening on the material? And the exception to that would be types of idealism or panpsychism that have gradients of consciousness. So basic consciousness is fundamental for panpsychism, but complex consciousness is emergent. And then for Kastrop's view is unitary consciousness is fundamental, and separate consciousness is emergent. And if we can categorize, I guess, into three different groups, is consciousness fundamental, or is material fundamental, or is material fundamental, is consciousness fundamental, or is there a gradient, either a gradient or a switch from unitary to separateness? If we can categorize them like that, we could probably fit most of the views in one of those three boxes. And this takes me to another idea, which, I mean, I just call it recursive emergent or backward emergence, but I mean, this idea has been going on for a while. We see this similar idea in a lot of religion or mysticism. But we also see it in quantum physics. So John Wheeler, the guy who I think he coined the term black hole, his idea is of a participatory universe. And he has a symbol. The symbol is like a big U with an eye at one side on the right side. And the eye is looking back at the beginning of the U. And so what it symbolizes is that until consciousness came into the world was an indeterminate state. And because consciousness came into the world, it solidifies the past. So the future creates the past. This idea of future creating the past, or this teleological argument, we can find, of course, in mysticism and religion. But it's the idea that normally when people say the word emergent, they mean something is just emergent, or something is less real because it's emergent. But this view takes a totally different, it puts it backwards and says, well, no, the emergent property is actually the most fundamental property. It's the emergent property that creates the world out of which it emerges. Of course, now it's like really theoretical. I don't know how we could prove something like this, or how we could get a metaphor. But I guess one kind of metaphor, I mean, at least in theory, in the thought experiment, is like, you have evolution creating humans, humans creating computers, supercomputer in the future eventually creates the Big Bang. So that's the loop it goes in. And so therefore, the emergent property is not, just because it's emergent does not mean it's not fundamental or less fundamental than whatever precedes it. And this ties back into you mentioned about block time, the idea that the universe is a block. Everything past, present, and future is in this block. And therefore, in our way of understanding linearity, we consider the beginning to be the cause and the end to be the effect. But it is, if you think of it in a teleological conception, it is the telos, the end, that calls the beginning into being. And therefore, it is the end that is more fundamental than the beginning. If you have this kind of view, it kind of it turns emergence around, at least in regards. So again, I think that the two questions trying to answer, especially when you talk about consciousness and emergence, we're trying to answer what is the relationship between consciousness and the world, and what does that say about the fundamentality of consciousness? Is consciousness a secondary thing and therefore less real or less fundamental or dependent on the material? Or is it always existing in some way, like panpsychism? Or is there something like recursive emergence, where actually it is the end goal of evolution perhaps is consciousness, and consciousness is what instigated evolution to begin in the first place?
All right, so a lot of interesting stuff there. Yeah, this gets into a little bit into debates like whether evolution itself is like a goal-directed thing. Um, yeah, so one thing that I want to, so you mentioned the idea of the future kind of creating the past, right? Yeah, one thing I would say about that, yeah, there may be some kind of deep metaphysical way in which that's true. I don't know. I try to avoid, I mean, not avoid, but I don't feel yet sure about my own views on that. I've been listening in kind of preparation for this. I've been listening to, Michael Silberstein, I'm not sure. An interesting philosopher, and he's someone who talks about, he's a kind of block universe guy. Um, and yeah, I don't know about stuff like that really, but there is a kind of way in which I think the novel, or the new, if we can still use that, or anything that's emergent, even if it's, not absolutely new or whatever, it creates a new past. This is something George Herbert Mead talks about. At least it creates a new past for us, like as we seek to account for that new thing, whether it's a new life form, or a new kind of art, or um, a new animal that we discover, or whatever. It'll be a new life form, or a new process in physics or something, each time there's this kind of newness, we try to account for that, and we, in a sense, create a new past. Um, I think I would tend to believe, maybe this is naive, that the past is gone, whatever. There's things that still exist, presumably from the past, but the past, that time is gone. It doesn't exist in a metaphysical or ontological sense, but that might be just kind of a naive way of thinking of it. But at least in a kind of a epistemological way, newness does create new past
Yeah.
for us, because we have to come up with explanations, and things that didn't seem important before about the past are now important because they led up to this thing. They were one of the conditions for this new thing. So there is at least a maybe more naive or epistemological view of making sense of that resonates with me, even though I don't want to at this point go as far as saying that kind of the future some metaphysical deep sense creates the past. Yeah, that's
I
one
guess
thing. Yeah,
another metaphor I have is obviously it only works if there's conscious beings. The idea of like building a house. Now, is it the bricks? Let's just say it's a brick house. Is it the bricks that are most fundamental or that come first, or does the house in potentiality come first? So if you think about building a house, right, what comes first is the idea of the house, the final idea.
right. Yeah,
And the final idea is what pulls the bricks into that. I mean, obviously, by pulling the bricks, it means you get the bricks and do it yourself. But
yeah.
the idea is that
If only it was so easy.
it's this final concept or final image that draws reality to itself. And therefore, so for me, it seems that it's possible to have both the beginning and the end be in equilibrium with each other. So if we talk about what's more fundamental, is it the image of the house or is it the bricks? And we can say, well, they're both equally fundamental because the image of the house without the bricks cannot exist, or it doesn't exist, right? Because it has to take the bricks in order to become real. But the bricks without the image of the house also don't exist, or at least if we talk about the final thing as being a house. So it seems that it's possible to have this symmetry between past and future, and I guess this might tie into the block universe concept, because obviously the block universe is symmetrical. But this also ties into the concept like with Kastrop's dissociated alters. The idea that one separates into the many is a asymmetrical, position to be in. But if you have something that's recursive, or something that's another way to say recursive, I guess, would be like a partnership or a relationship, right? If you have a relationship, it kind of changes the asymmetry into a symmetrical system. If the telos needs the initial in order to become itself, and the initial needs the telos in order to strive into what it will become, then we can have some kind of unity, a unity of difference. Obviously, all of these concepts are kind of in some way tied into theology or religion. Like when you start talking about consciousness creating something, you're kind of in the realm of theology already. And that's why I particularly like John Wheeler and his concepts of quantum science, because they tie in those two views together. But yeah, so that's where I'm heading towards, is something like that. That's why I would have. So Kastrop's dissociate alters always bothers me when I hear these terms, because it seems so disassociated. Just these words sound negative, and but what bothers me is the asymmetricalness of the system. And I'm trying to create some way of thinking of the world that is symmetrical, that can merge them together.
So merging together, so symmetrical between, remind me of the two things that are symmetrical here.
Well, so for instance, if we're talking about emergent, so the newness and the old, if we talk about something new, I mean, by indicating there's something new, we mean there's something old. So putting the new and the old on equal footing, so it's a symmetrical relationship. putting the world and the emergent property as symmetrical relationship, uh, putting consciousness and the world in symmetrical relationship, putting God and man in symmetrical relationship. So it counts for everything. But so I'm interested to hear about your pragmatic view, because you also just mentioned that now you're leaning to panpsychism, but I guess you're tying that into pragmatism. So whenever life exists, consciousness exists. So maybe you want to explain your particular view on that.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit joking about the panpsychist thing. This is also a common idea in biosemiotics, and I'm more of a follower of biosemiotics, where semiosis and life are coextensive things. Semiosis being part of that being experience, consciousness, mind, whatever you want to call it. So semiosis begins with life. You could say experience in some form begins with life. This is also held by people like biologist Nick Lane, who would, I think, not call himself a panpsychist. I was surprised to see this described as panpsychism, but I thought it would be fun to call myself a panpsychist, just because why not? Yeah, so I do want to, yeah, so I can say something more about my own views. I also like that example of the house and stuff. The way I would see it is, so human is something that humans can do is to kind of imagine ends, use symbols to create ends for themselves or goals, which presumably most animals don't do. Something that emerges with the emergence of language, a whole other topic, but actually quite related. But I don't, yeah, a whole other very complicated topic, the emergence of language. But yeah, once you get symbols, we can come up with, a design of a house, a plan for a house, a plan for this or that other thing. But then I think there is a kind of symmetrical relationship there. I mean, you can talk about that as idealistic or whatever, but to actually implement that, you have to engage in the material world, interact with the material world, and the course of your interactions may end up changing. Things that you thought you could do may not turn out to be possible. You have to engage in these very practical things. Can I actually get the materials? Can I fit them together in this way? Does everything actually work when I try to do it? And you adjust your plans, right? You adjust the design, you adjust the telos, the end. So I think there is this kind of back and forth. I would maybe see it as kind of an interaction between our ideals and practical material reality. I don't know if it's symmetrical or not, but maybe you could think of it as being symmetrical. But there are these two pretty different things, right? There's the symbol on the one hand, and then there's the material reality that you create through being guided by the symbol. And I think that's one important kind of function of consciousness is that we produce these symbols, these ends for ourselves. We evaluate them, we judge them, we argue about them, and then at the end of the day, we have to apply them and see if they actually work. And you get this feedback and all of that. So yeah, I mean,
So
does that make sense to you?
there's also some, when people talk about emergence, they also talk about sometimes downward causation, where the second order properties start to influence the first order or influence itself, which is a kind of recurrence view. But so I like the idea of I have to, if we talk about panpsychism as, or like the child to growing up to the adult, we have to account for the linearity. So if we have basic consciousness and you put a bunch of them together and you get complicated consciousness or complex consciousness, where we get this linear line. To me, it seems complicated, or it seems difficult to think of linearity in relation to reality, because right, for me it seems it seems easier to think of reality. I also don't like the idea of a circle. I don't like circular reality. Everything exists over and over. Like I prefer perhaps a funnel view, or like the whirlpool that you talked about. but yeah, so my problem with these kinds of panpsychisms or you know any kind of emergent or evolutionary process that only goes in a line, it seems to have an issue because it ties itself into time, right? There,
Hmm.
beginning and end, it ties itself into time, but I don't see time as being a fundamental property. I think
Yeah.
I see time as being like an emergent property out of the algorithms of nature. Um, and like we go back to the Big Bang and or black holes, the concepts of time and all that starts to fall apart. And the idea of a block universe comes from uh, observations of black holes and the idea that if you were at the edge of a black hole, you would look at our universe and you would see the whole universe as one, like beginning and end, like a block. Um, and so I have difficulty with theories that are dependent on time as a fundamental property for the theory. But I guess like you mentioned before about the difference between ontological and epistemological views, um, like in our natural world, obviously, like if something new comes in the world, we can create a new past for it. Obviously, it doesn't mean that it actually created a new past. It just means our knowledge of the past was created anew. Um, but I think if we're talking about metaphysical concepts, we have to have a metaphysics that can account for the non-fundamentality of time, and therefore I have some issues with linearity. I also reject the eternal cycle concepts, but yeah, I find that there's some way to merge those concepts together.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that time is not fundamental. Um, but I wonder if it's fundamental for
For us.
life. Yeah, I mean, it's not fundamental per se, but it does seem to be, well, it's phenomenologically fundamental, maybe. Um, Fundamental for living things, perhaps. I mean, the idea of process is kind of a time-dependent concept. Um, so it does seem that once time emerges, I mean, this is the whole thing, maybe, is that when new things emerge, they add new things to reality. Maybe they weren't fundamental in historically looking at the beginning of the universe, but once they get added to reality, once life gets added to reality, once new kinds of behaviors get added to reality, they are part of reality then and can influence other new things. So
So they
once you
become the
do get,
constraints.
yeah, it becomes a new constraint on what else can happen. So yeah, I think maybe that's one way of kind of resolving that is you don't need time to be fundamental as long as it becomes a new constraint, like once it emerges, whatever that means in the case of time. I'm not an expert on time at all, so
So
uh
I guess for your view, you might even just avoid emergence totally because consciousness doesn't really emerge because it's just a description of behavior. It's just a description of the biological organism.
well, it's not just a description of the biological organism. In my view, I would say that when life really gets going, and there's a lot of steps leading up to life, whether you begin with something like Terry Deacon's autogenic virus or Nick Lane's protocell, and we wouldn't necessarily consider those alive. Maybe some people would, some people wouldn't. Like when you get to something that's like clearly life, like a single-celled organism, maybe these ancient kinds of bacteria, perhaps, you get a unity, in my view, of structure, behavior, and experience. I think all living things, you can look at their structure, you can see what they do, you can speculate at least about their experience, and you can even, there's ways of studying the experience of, say, other people and also other non-human things and get a good sense of that they're able to feel stuff, respond to various kinds of stimuli in different ways and so on. And there's something that's good for them, something that's bad for them. So I think once life gets started, you have these interlinked things. We separate them in analysis. So I think people separate out behavior and say that's one thing, and consciousness is another thing, and anatomy, that's another thing. But I think these are just analytical distinctions. And in reality and fundamental reality, as that concerns life, I think these are all totally integrated, unified things. You can't have in nature, you can't have behavior without experience. You can't have behavior without organization, without anatomy and all of that, without physiology. So,
So could consciousness be something like software that you could just detach from the hardware and put it somewhere else?
not in my view, no.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't believe in, I mean, yeah, I don't, so to put it maybe more strongly than I might want to, I don't believe you could say upload your consciousness to a computer, for example. I think
Because the
that doesn't
consciousness is
conceptually doesn't
dependent.
make any sense.
Consciousness is dependent on the material substrate. So
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
like
I wouldn't even say
so
that
kind of
it's
like a
dependent. It just
panpsychist.
is. I mean, I think it just is part of that. It just is part. You can't behave without experience. It just the experience is in the behavior. It is in the organism.
So
It's
it's like the
not
color of
dependent on. It
something.
just. Well, how do you mean?
Well, I've seen this explanation of somewhere about how the concept of something like consciousness could be something like what we say something has color, um, and the color being the refraction of light on the particular properties of whatever object it is. And so it's a kind of like an emergent property because you need a world, you need light to give the color, but you the the color of something is not necessarily uh, it's not necessarily a feature of it. So like
Ye-
if you so you can't upload your consciousness, you can't detach your consciousness from your body, and so therefore is that every cell of your body together gives this thing that we call consciousness in a panpsychist kind of view or
Well,
procedurally like.
I wouldn't build it up in most panpsychist kind of ways. There's probably a sense in which each cell in your body has a certain kind of experience. We're not obviously aware
Or
of.
maybe more like the fusion one where they're your cells are not having an experience, but you are, but you're only having that experience because of the cells that are in your body.
Yeah. And I think the central nervous system here is probably important as an integrator of experience. So it's not that I wouldn't say
And
that
there's
the sort of the brain is conscious or the central nervous system is conscious, but the organism, the person is conscious in virtue of the fact of having certain kinds of organs, systems in their body,
and
being able to act in certain ways.
we can't peel this consciousness off your cells, just like you can't peel the color off a fruit. Uh, so is like that's your view that there. So what kind of view is that's not a dualist view? That's something else where it's just it's kind of like just you have a substance and consciousness is an description of that substance. It cannot be removed from it.
Well, it's help. So you mentioned before, and the color example is confusing me a bit, but you mentioned before the idea of reverse engineering consciousness, and that can be a useful exercise. So one way to go about it, um, try not to make this tedious or anything, but so you can begin with like non-living matter, and non-living matter, so Dewey would say it shows biases, right? So it's not totally um, unrelated to experience in a certain way. It's biased. Chemicals are biased to interact in certain ways with other chemicals. Uh, and when you get those in certain under certain circumstances, you get life eventually. So let's jump ahead to life. With the first living organisms, you get something like feeling. It's not the feeling that we would know, that we would understand really or recognize. But when you get life that is trying to stay alive, there becomes then something that's good or bad for it. And I think it makes sense to say that the organism in a way feels when it's desirous of something, when it is lacking something that it needs, um, and is able to select what it needs from the environment. So whereas with inanimate matter, you have bias towards certain kinds of interactions, you have a similar thing in kind of primitive organisms where there's a bias toward this substance rather than that substance. We can maybe call this more a selection. It goes after this rather than that. It tries to bring itself into contact with this rather than that. This thing maybe is experienced as good for it. This thing is as experienced as bad for it in some sense. So we're getting like the very rudiments of what we
Yeah.
might call later on consciousness.
Then so what would it be that's emerging? So it's not like a substance or uh, I mean, I guess it might be a property in the way that a color is a property of something, but um,
I mean, it's kind of a state of the organism, right? So with the organism lacking something that it needs for energy or whatever, or
but so
being satiated by,
this internal state that has a particular feeling, this internal world, like so this internal world, it doesn't only supervene on the material world, in your view, it actually is the thing it's supervening on. Like it's totally connected to the underlying material.
yeah, I think supervenience is a misleading concept because you get the idea that there's it's a new kind of substance being produced that
Yeah.
is somehow tied to this other kind of substance. Whereas I see it more as just an integral part of that process of living. So it's not something that
So
supervenes, it's just,
would you have to like update your view or update the view of the materialist view? Because if material matter can have internal worlds, right, then that really changes our idea of what we mean when we say material.
well, yeah, living material when it's brought into new kinds
Certain
of
higher order
interaction, certain
complexity.
complex
So there is some
interactions.
kind of emergence. There is something that's arising from this complexity. This inner world arises from that complexity. So we can't find it, or we can find it at different degrees in like animals, plants, and rocks. But it's emerging in its complexity. It actually does seem quite a lot like panpsychism.
Perhaps.
Hmm.
Um, at least some versions of panpsychism. So yeah, I think when you start getting new, I mean, if you look at it evolutionarily a little bit, so you start getting more complex organisms, you develop things like eyesight, hearing, things that we take to be really, really kind of central to our experience of consciousness for most of us, right? Eyesight and hearing are kind of like, especially eyesight, sight, vision is for those of us who are, kind of have those abilities, that's like really central to how we kind of experience the world, how we understand consciousness. But that was a new thing at one time, right? Having
Yeah.
eyesight was a new thing, and that changed our experience. Like we were no longer just kind of like feeling good or bad. This is good for me. This is bad for me. We were seeing like something in the distance, like I want that, right? That would be good for me. I'm going to go after it. Or you
Yeah.
see a predator, that's going to be bad for me. I'm going to run from it. And you get these new kinds of, we might call them states of consciousness. I don't know, states of mind, experiences. We can just say experiences. You get a new kind of experience, but it's related. It's totally interconnected, intertwined with a new form of behavior, right? It's connected with being able to move around,
Yeah.
with being multicellular and being able to move around quickly from one place to another. So it's
This kind of
entirely
ties
dependent
in.
on our anatomy, on our behavior. Yeah.
It kind of ties into what I mentioned before about the capacity for consciousness as the thing being emergent. So, I mean, I guess we can look at the same evidence or the same metaphors and have different conclusions in that if you a priori tie in consciousness to the material, then you can describe, okay, you have sight, you have hearing, you have these new things that come into consciousness. It's a kind of emergence or evolution of consciousness as it gets more and more complex. But the other way to look at it is also is that the capacity for consciousness is what's emerging. But the underlying consciousness or the concept of an inner world, this whatever this inner world stuff is made out of, that perhaps that is not what is emerging or evolving. Maybe it's just the receptacle or the capacity to experience the consciousness that is emerging. And perhaps the consciousness stuff is already there in its full form, and plants, animals, people are just uh, evolving their structure in order to be able to access or to encounter or the experience of this consciousness. So that view also ties into a lot of different types of idealism. Um, and I think that's where I'm, so we're using both the same examples of this, getting eyesight and getting hearing and stuff, but I'm interpreting more as a kind of the material is expanding to understand the non-material. And you're explaining it more as, well, the immaterial is part or is the material, and they're both expanding. Um, Now, do I think where I'm stuck at the moment is wondering if we can say a new kind of consciousness emerges. Like, I think fundamentally the idea that there is a reality outside of time. If time itself is not fundamental, then whatever the final stage is, it's already done. It's already there. And even if there is a linearity, it's there in the sense of potential. So the oak tree is already existing in the acorn as a potentiality. So is there new consciousness coming into the world? Is the new consciousness or is a new type of consciousness emergent? Or is it that this consciousness, this fully formed consciousness already exists and the world is evolving into it or into the expression of it? And yeah, that would probably be my view that ties in emergence, the idea that something new, we seem to see new things in the world, tying that into a non-materialistic ontology that doesn't reduce it all to a static idealism, but is like a dynamic process. It retains a dynamic process, but doesn't reduce itself either to materialism or idealism in that sense.
Yeah, so I think there's some interesting stuff to talk here. And I do want to ask maybe, well, I want to respond and also ask a question. My question is going to be about what is the motivation for taking consciousness as kind of a fundamental thing or an immaterial thing that we're kind of getting into maybe more intimate or complex contact with. So that's one thing to think about. I do want to say, so this idea of the inner world, I think, is important to explain. And I think is something that is emergent, but I think but for me personally, I think it comes at a late stage of evolution. I think it comes when you have language, especially, probably not before you get language. And I think the sense that we have an inner world, I don't think there is, I mean, it depends what you mean by, ontologically inner world. There's definitely a private world.
Hmm.
So I maybe want to describe it as perhaps a private world. And I think this is a development in, again, in behavior and experience, especially through language, and where we start realizing that we can, in effect, act privately. We can, for example, talk to ourselves, and this is using the same physiology, the same anatomy, and so forth that we use when we talk out loud, but it's doing it on a very tiny scale. This is actually measurable. But it's, yeah, it's a very, very reduced scale. So when you talk to yourself, you're actually talking. Um, but it's at such a small scale, you don't notice the behavior unless you train yourself to actually notice the behavior. Um, but it's still behavior. I would still call having a conversation with yourself is still a behavior. It's a socially learned behavior. Kids learn how to do this. They're not born knowing how to do this. Um, that's where we get this idea that we have kind of this immaterial inner world, I think, is that we're able to behave in these private ways, reduce our behavior to such an extent that it's no longer publicly observable. And we kind of build these inner worlds with ourselves, in ourselves, I don't know. But we kind of have these conversations with ourselves. We engage in
What about the
perceptual.
concept of imagination? Let's say you imagine something.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the same
How would
thing.
you explain that in terms of behavior?
Yeah, well, you've written that perception is behavior, I think, somewhere. Um, and imagination is perception. It's just perception in the absence of the object. So, in
Well, I guess
um,
there's two pieces to imagination. There's the perception of it, but there's the content creation part. So it's the content
right.
creation part that's most interesting as far as inner world
Yeah.
arguments.
So when you imagine something, you're acting the way you would act if that thing were in your perceptual world. So I can, um, when I imagine, say, the Eiffel Tower, my body is acting as it would act, at least to some extent. It's never really as vivid or whatever as it would be in person. Um, but my body is acting as it would act if I were looking at the Eiffel Tower. Just there happens to not be any Eiffel Tower in front of me at the moment. And of course, by manipulating your behaviors, you can imagine things that don't exist, for example, and imagine all kinds of crazy stuff. But it's rooted in your, I mean, it is still, I wouldn't say even rooted in, it just is those same old behavioral processes.
And back to your question about the motivations, I think in questions of philosophy, actually a lot of science as well, when it comes to free will, determinism, I think the most important question to ask, like you mentioned, is the motivations. Like, what is it that causes people to want to be a determinist or to believe in free will? Like, it seems like even if someone says, I just follow the facts or I follow where the evidence goes, I mean, why do you follow where the evidence goes? Like, why is that your motivation? And so if it comes like why would I interpret the same world that you're seeing? Why would I interpret it not as just an extension of behavior? Why would I interpret it as something immaterial like consciousness being a fundamental element? Uh, and I guess there's a couple of reasons. And the first one, I guess, maybe is a practical reason. The practical reason is that I can't step outside of consciousness. So I can't remove myself from consciousness and say, okay, here's the material world divorced from consciousness. So it's like there's a structure and the foundation is consciousness. And everything I know, everything I can experience, everything I can see, everything is built on top of that structure. And therefore, it seems awkward to me to it's like the person sawing off the tree or the tree branch while they're on it. It seems awkward to me to to stipulate that that this consciousness is not fundamental. And I find the same problem with people who are determinists. I'm like, it seems it's the same example, like the person sawing off the tree branch. You're saying you don't believe in determinate. I mean, you're saying you believe in determinism, and you're saying that while you are using your faculty of agency, while you are using your faculty of agency, you're saying there's no agency. So while you're using your faculty of consciousness, you're saying that consciousness is not fundamental, which is the same kind of problem to me. So that's my first response to that. But my second response, I suppose, would be be more. It ties into my other theory of reality being somewhat dependent or codependent on the individual, and therefore what the individual desires or wants is reflected in reality, and therefore, if I ask myself, what is it that I want? Do I want human beings to be conscious? And people might dismiss this view as, well, you can't just project your desires onto reality. Like, reality is objective. But my view is that, well, reality may not be as objective as the objectionists or the objectivists believe it is. And, a lot of other people have a similar kind of view, especially in quantum physics, like I mentioned with John Wheeler. The idea that reality might not be as objective. And I also don't agree with the idea that reality is totally subjective. I think there is some kind of relationship going on, a co-creation relationship going on. And therefore, my motivation besides the idea that you're standing on consciousness when you make any claim about consciousness, is that what motivates me, what moves me, I would prefer a world where human beings are real, where the person is real. And therefore, I will instinctively reject things that say the self does not exist, or there's no such thing as free will, or everything can be reduced to non-organic matter, just based on that beginning assumption. But I find that assumption is supported by evidential facts. One being that everything we say and do depends on consciousness. So yeah. And I suppose, what would be your motivations?
Well, let me maybe respond to a little bit of that. And I first will say that, there's a long history of, I think, respectable views in that line of thinking. So I think it's a totally reasonable position. But I would want to wonder, so we talked about time a little bit before, and time maybe not being fundamental, but once a kind of temporality emerges, that serves maybe as a new kind of constraint, something new in the world that then becomes fundamental in a certain way. And I would want to ask maybe if consciousness could be that sort of thing too. Like maybe it's not, doesn't have to be necessarily ultimately fundamental, but it comes into, at least in my view, it comes in when you get life. Maybe you would want to put that at a different line, draw a different line somewhere, maybe earlier, maybe later, I don't know. But once you do get that, then it makes kind of new things possible, maybe makes some things less possible, I don't know. But it becomes fundamental, at least at a certain point in kind of cosmological development, cosmological history, but it doesn't necessarily need to be fundamental per se.
Yeah, so then goes my view about the recurrence emergence, or backward causation. So even if something emerges out of nothing, is the nothingness or the material, is that more fundamental? Or is the somethingness or the consciousness actually the telos that guides or that draws the material to itself? So even if it is the case that there is non-organic matter and then consciousness emerges out of non-organic matter, I would take the view of the participatory universe that has consciousness once it comes into the universe, creating the past or creating its emergence. So creating the world that it emerges from. And therefore, we escape the idea that the thing that comes first being more fundamental.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find a quote, but I don't think I can find it. But Dewey says something that might be useful here, which is that you can we tend to think, we tend to be looking for what is fundamental. But one of his points was that maybe you get a better sense of what nature is by looking at effects rather than causes. Because effects, or maybe called emergences here, what is emergent, that is the indication of what kind of was potential, what was latent maybe in previous nature. So
Hmm.
we're always,
So similar to like
scientists,
potentiality,
yeah. And
it was always latent in, so consciousness was always in the material world in a
yeah,
kind
I
of
think there you can probably say
potentiality.
that, yeah, I think you could reasonably say that consciousness was a potentiality in kind of pre-organic
It must have
nature, and
been
that's demonstrated by the fact, yeah, it must
the
have been
fact that
because
it's here.
yeah.
Huh.
So you can see it as a potential, maybe fundamentally potential. What would be the right way to say this? A fundamental potentiality, perhaps, without being a fundamental actuality. I wonder what if that would make sense to you. Rather, seeing consciousness as kind of a
Well,
fundamental
see,
potentiality
the
rather than
potential,
actuality.
the concept of potentiality is very close to the concept of teleology. So,
Yeah.
so if something exists in potential, then we would say it is in some way as fundamental as whatever exists in actuality. Um, and if the thing that exists in potential is what causes the thing in actuality to develop into itself, then that's like, is the oak tree the final view of the acorn? Is that it exists, and obviously it must exist in potentiality if we have an acorn and it ends up becoming an oak tree. So it must already exist in potentiality. And is that potentiality as fundamental as the acorn? And the answer for people who have the potentiality view would be yes, that the potentiality and the actuality have some kind of symmetry in their relationship to reality.
Yeah. But I think you can only, I mean, I would probably agree. I would maybe only add that you can only know potentiality through actuality, right? We can't really know what's
But
potential
then we get
until
the
it
idea of
becomes
the
actual.
simulatability. So we can
Yeah.
simulate and then see the path. I mean, it gets more complicated when you talk about multiple potentialities. So the oak tree is just a singular potentiality. But what happens if a particle can go in like 100 different directions and they all are equally potential? Does that mean that 100 different realities have a potentiality that's as fundamental as base reality? Then we get into like multiverse concepts, but which I don't really agree with anyways, but it's interesting.
Yeah. Hmm. That's yeah, I don't know. So yeah, there's some wrinkles that I would have to think through. I'm not sure uh about some of that. But yeah, I think there is something there in the concept of potentiality. Um, I don't know. Do you still want to, well, I don't know. Have you had any kind of, we should probably start to wrap things up, but yeah, any
Yeah, if you tell us
changes
what's
of,
your motivations for your view for the behavioralist interpretation of the facts.
yeah, so I've been listening to these podcasts sometimes with scientists and philosophers, and scientists and philosophers, there's a certain kind of scientist and philosopher that will say that they want to know what really is, what reality is really like. And I can say that that is not my motivation. I think that's as we've talked about before, I think that's an impossible question, possibly a meaningless question. Um, but I have more, like I want a way of thinking that is practically oriented, that can enable us in solving complicated problems, solving human problems, making life better, being aware of the consequences of our actions, and so on. I see explanation as not giving us, some people, philosophers will talk about explanation as if it's supposed to give them the actual reality. I see explanation as basically stating the conditions that will allow us to better predict something or control something or produce something. It doesn't need to be, and we couldn't necessarily totally know if it's actually
Yeah.
100% accurate. I mean, we know it works for what we want to do. And so that's kind of the approach that I bring to consciousness as well. What conditions can we state that make sense of the emergence of consciousness, such that we can predict things about it, such that we can control things about it, produce it maybe in the case that we might want to produce conscious machines or something, or look for conscious life other places in the universe. What might we look for? Where might we predict that we would find consciousness elsewhere in the universe? So those are my kind of motivations, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I still come back to this. This email you sent a long time ago that you were referencing someone who distinguishes between two different personality types. Do you remember what that was? The
Yeah, I
personality
forget. I don't
like
remember if it was,
mysticism or what was it? Mystery. I think one
yeah,
was mystery.
people who love mystery and
Yeah.
yeah, people who are attracted, I guess, attracted to mystery, and people who try to see a mystery and they try to deflate it.
So maybe the answer is in some kind of teamwork between the two perspectives, between the two desires or the two
Yeah,
impulses.
yeah, and
Interesting.
I mean, and then maybe looking towards the future, I think that's why I enjoy interacting with you so much in these kind of podcast things, video things. And I'm hoping that we can maybe bring in some other people with maybe different perspectives from either of us once in a while. Because I've realized that I don't that much like interacting with people who are similar to me. I want to find people who will interact in a friendly manner, a good faith manner, who are different, have a different perspective.
Yeah, I think it
Maybe
definitely
see,
enriches
yeah,
enriches your own experience to have this interaction with alternative views.
yeah,
I mean, and then maybe out of that, some kind of synthesis will come, some kind of emergence. Something will
yeah,
emerge from the
yeah,
different views.
yeah. So maybe with that in mind, we'll hopefully I have some things in the works anyways that hopefully will be posting some maybe conversations with other people who maybe one of us agrees with more or less, or maybe neither of us totally agree with, but maybe we can have
Yeah,
some
sounds good.
kind of good conversations and
Great.
develop
Thanks so
our
much.
own ideas. So yeah, thank you. It's been
Yeah.
fun. All right, bye.
Bye.